This class will be concerned with features of a business research report. Now, the class overlaps to some extent with other classes in this module. However, it'll add new material, it'll add new perspectives, and it'll amplify some of the points that appear in the other videos as well. So it's worth looking at this video, and it's worth making notes from it. And add these notes to the notes you've made from the previous videos. So it's important to build up your own set of notes and your own ideas about the issues involved in this particular area, the business research report area. Having said that, let's now start. We'll start with the problem definition. It's essential that the researcher knows what the problem is. It's essential that the researcher identifies the problem right at the outset and has clarity regarding the problem. A problem is any situation which requires further investigation. That seems a very straightforward definition of a problem. Research helps to refine the decision making. In business, research is used to facilitate decision making. It helps the decision maker to understand the problem, understand the issues, understand all of the associated issues before a decision is made. And that is crucially important. Now, the problem definition, well, for a start, clear and precise and to-the-point statements of a problem provide clues for the solution. So it's important that the researcher and the business person understand exactly what the problem is before any work is done on researching it and then subsequently acting on the conclusions of the research. So the problem must be clearly understood. If it's vague or general or inaccurate statement of the problem, then confusion will arise, and the researcher can lead to wrong decisions. The conclusions of the research can distort the decision and lead to bad decisions being made, which can ultimately cost the company a lot of resources and even endanger the company. So very clear problem statements are required. Now let's look at the research objectives. Well, the purpose of the project is to facilitate decision making. In other words, help the decision maker to make good decisions, and also to reduce risk associated with the process of decision making. The decision maker faces risk, faces uncertainty if it's decisions relating to the future, which normally they are. And there may be many factors to be taken into account, and perhaps the decision maker may overlook some of those factors. Now, research puts everything into a document so that the decision maker has clarity with regard to the issues confronting him or her. The purpose is also to discover opportunities which can be profitably exploited. Research is very good at looking at issues and turning what seems to be a problem into perhaps an advantage by looking at an issue associated with a product, and by redefining the product, redesigning it, looking at it in a new perspective, perhaps a new product could be generated, one which will more readily meet the needs of the customer and be more successful in the market. So research gives new insights, and that's good. Now, every research follows a well-set, planned of objectives. The research must be organized. It must have objectives and it must be well set out. There could be general and specific objectives. For example, the general objective is to solve the problem, whatever the problem is. But there could also be specific objectives. For example, looking at a particular aspect of the product to see if it could be redesigned. Now that could be a very specific task. So the overall research is looking at the suitability of the product in the market, and there's a specific brief to look at some particular issue associated with the product. Its functionality in some way. So there can be general, which applies to the whole issue, and specific, which apply to particular parts of the problem. The research objectives should be stated as statements. It's important that the research objectives are clearly set out and clearly understood, because it's the research objectives that's going to drive the research. The research objectives have identified the problem, whatever the problem was. It has worked out the general problem that needs to be solved, and it's asking the researcher to look at some specific issues as well, and these are set out as statements. Now let's look at the background material. Include a review of any previous research or descriptions of conditions that caused the project to be authorized. So background material is, it's always good to look at previous research in the area. What problems occurred in the past, and what solutions were found, and how was the research undertaken at that time. It's a good pointer for how to do it now. And examine preliminary results from a past piece of research and consult secondary data from various sources. Secondary data is available. It's been compiled by other people, compiled by the government, or compiled by trade associations or the Chamber of Commerce or whoever. So access to that material may be useful and much cheaper than trying to collect the information yourself. But examine the preliminary results from past pieces of research. That can certainly help to shortcut and cut costs on the current research, because it's possible to learn from the mistakes of the past. It's possible to learn from the way in which past research was conducted. Reference secondary data, definitions and assumptions. That's important. It's important to show where the data came from and whose definition it is and what assumptions are made. So it's very important to deal with that. And then there's methodology. Now the methodology is the method of the work, of the research. The methodology is the method. Methodology is the study of method. The methodology is the process that will be undertaken to collect the data. And the methodology may start with sampling design. It may be that it's looking at customer needs, now in which case it has to identify the population of customers, who are the customers, and then draw a sample. So how is that sample worked out? What is the research design? How will the sample be approached? Will they be approached with questionnaires or interviews or focus groups, or how will the sampling be conducted? Which is really an issue of data collection. Data collection is actually picking up the information, or the data, I should say, pick up the data that will be processed into information in the analysis. And having got the data, it's important to analyze the data. What techniques for analysis will be used? Will they be statistical techniques, or will they be simply tabulations, or how exactly will the information be looked at? How exactly will the data be looked at, I should say, and converted into information? What are the limitations on this approach? What assumptions are made, and was the sample size large enough, and was there bias in the questions, and was it pre-tested? Was there a pilot survey to try and iron out any problems in the design of the questionnaire or of the interview questions? So what limitations were there in the whole exercise, and how will these limitations limit the findings? So having got all of that, we've got down to the findings. What did the research activity find? And then from the findings, draw the conclusions. The conclusions are based entirely on the findings, on nothing else. The conclusions follow directly from the findings. And then move to the recommendations. The findings and the conclusions in particular, indicate what the recommendations of the research are. Put in appendices to show any materials that were collected and used that the reader would not normally be able to find, or find easily. So explain any calculations in the appendices, any charts, any graphs, any technicalities, definitions, or so on. So put those into the appendices. And finally, include a bibliography of all the sources that were used. Now what we're going to do in the remainder of this session is to look at each of these very quickly, go through it, and just have a few words about each of them to see what they mean. And we're going to start with sampling design. Define the target population and the sampling method to be used. Discuss necessary information, such as the type of sampling, if it's probability or non-probability, which one was used. Probability sampling is seen as somewhat more scientific, more mathematical. Non-probability could be snowball sampling, asking friends to recommend their friends. Or it could be just simply someone standing on the street with a clipboard trying to pick up information. Non-probability sampling is biased, and that's the problem with it. It leads to poor results. The types of probability sampling, simple random or complex random, or non-probability sampling, say for example quota sampling or snowball sampling used. So it's important in the research to identify which one was used. Simple random sampling, the idea of every member of the population has an equal chance of selection, that seems to be the most scientific. That yields the best results, and there's a better chance of the sample being representative of the population when using that technique. The other techniques lead to bias. The factors influenced the determination of sample size and selection of the sampling elements. The sample size may be determined, I should say, by the budget. Perhaps the budget only allows a certain number of people to be contacted. And for that matter, the overall design of the sampling technique may be determined by the budget. If the budget is not extensive, then it's going to be cheap and the quickest method selected, but the quickest methods may not yield the best results. It's important to have confidence in the results and look at the margins of acceptable error. Say for example, it was a sample into customer needs and wanted to work out what was the average price that the customers would pay, would be willing to pay. I draw a sample, and having worked out what the average price they'd be willing to pay, how representative of the population average price is that one? Do they correspond? And the chances are there's a margin of error, but make the margin of error acceptable. Make it so that it's not too wide. And it means that the calculation in the sample is useful. Now the research design, well, should be carefully planned to yield results that are as objective as possible. It's important that the results are seen as objective. It should contain information on the nature of the research design. How was the research design worked out? How was the sampling done? Why was this technique used as opposed to a different technique? Why was it in this area as opposed to a different area? Why at that time and not a different time? So the nature of the research design should be discussed. If questionnaires are used, they should be worked out carefully. They should be pre-tested and the wording sorted out so that it's not ambiguous, and the questions in logical order. So there's an element for time should be spent on development and pre-testing of questionnaires. And then look at the data that was gathered. Was it useful in the sense that it was gathered according to the objectives of the survey? The objectives of the survey is to collect useful information. Well, was the information collected in a scientific way so it's useful? Or was it collected just quickly and haphazardly, in which case there should be disclaimers on its use. Care should be taken with the use of such data. There should be definition of the interview and the type of interviewers. The type of interviewers should be trained. They should be trained so that they can handle the situation, give prompts to the respondents if they're required, lead the respondents but not bias the results. So there's an issue about the interviewers. Sources, both primary and secondary, from which the data was collected, should be discussed. Primary sources of information in business are very valuable because they give a unique insight into a situation. So if a company conducts primary research into customer needs, it has information that its competitors does not have. Secondary information is available to everybody, so the competitors can get it the same as the company. But primary information has a uniqueness. The instruments could be the questionnaire, or if it's interviews, there could be some interview sheets that the interviewer records responses on. There may be scales trying to judge attitudes, for example. People have opinions about certain things. They like it a lot, or they simply like it, or they're neutral. or to dislike it, or to dislike it a lot. Now that's a 5-point scale, known as a Likert scale. But there are lots of issues and problems associated with using scales that measure attitudes. For a start, they don't really pick up on the strength of the preference. Somebody says, I dislike it. Do they dislike it a little or dislike it a lot? So there are issues in using attitudinal scales, and they should not be taken lightly. The designs of sampling, coding and methods of data input need to be discussed as well. How will the sampling take place, and how will the questions be coded, and how will they be analysed, how will they be input perhaps into a computer for analysis. But it does depend, of course, on the size of the sample and the complexity of the information that's sought. The whole strength and weaknesses of the exercise should be stated openly. What are the issues which weaken the exercise, distract from it? Perhaps the sampling method, or the budget didn't enable a large sample to be drawn, or whatever. What are the weaknesses? Then what are the strengths? What's the advantages of it? So there should be a statement that looks at both of these issues and makes it clear so that the reader can see that it's open and honest about the findings. So use the appendix to include copies of the questionnaire, as I said, calculations, graphs, whatever, information that was used but which would not be generally available, or information that was used but you don't want to put it into the main body of the report because it would clutter up the main write-up, make it difficult to read. Now let's move to data collection. The collection of primary data for business research is of paramount importance to assist management in making decisions. As I said earlier, it gives a uniqueness to the business. It gives them an insight that they would not otherwise have, and also that their competitors will not have, because it would be primary data. Generally, information regarding a large number of characteristics is necessary to analyze any problem pertaining to management. The problem with management and business reporting is that everything is complex. Dealing with people and dealing with demand is complex. Dealing with people in the organization and their motivation is complex. Motivating management is complex. Staff selection is complex. So data collection, not surprisingly, is complex. So care must be taken when designing research in business to try and get around the complexities and design a research procedure that can work and that can yield valuable results. The collection of primary data requires a great deal of deliberation and expertise. So collecting primary data is not a quick exercise. If it involves surveying customers, the customers have to be identified. The population of customers have to be identified. Perhaps a sample has to be drawn from that. How is the sample drawn? How will the people be contacted? What will happen for people who are contacted but don't want to participate? And so on and so on. So there are many issues associated with data collection, and it's important that you're aware of these. It's not simply a matter of designing a survey and going out and doing it. It's far more complex. Now, data analysis, well, provides information on different methods used to analyze the data. So the data analysis section of a report simply states about how the information is analyzed, or how it was analyzed. And there should be a justification for the method that was used. There are many methods that could be used: statistical, tabulations, pictorial representations of data. Many methods could be used. So why was the one that was used, why was it selected? Why that one? Justify it. And it should justify it based on the assumptions, whatever assumptions it set out. It should be sufficiently adequate to reveal its significance, and the methods of analysis used should be appropriate. It's important that the analysis is appropriate for the task and yields sufficient insight into the data. It's using the data. It's not wasting the data. It's using all the data, and it's using all the data to give an insight into the research area. So nothing is wasted. The validity and reliability of the data should be checked carefully. It provides details on data handling and groundwork analysis. Let's just deal with those two for a start. There's another one coming, but data handling, it's important that the data, when it's collected, is organized, coded, analyzed, and analyzed with the most appropriate method that yields the results that were set out in the objectives of the research. The research had objectives to get an insight into a certain phenomenon. The data should be handled in a way that it's collected, collated, and analyzed to give a perspective on that objective. Groundwork analysis means sorting out everything in a way that is logical, and it's sorted right from the start. So the whole process is organized right from the time the survey is delivered, the information is collected, the analysis starts with the application of techniques, and it's worked through the analysis until outcomes are determined. It could be that rational statistical tests are used, but as I said earlier, it depends on the size of the sample, it depends on the population, it depends on the topic under consideration, it depends on many factors. So there are different samples for different situations. Let's look at the limitations. Certain researchers tend to avoid this section, but this is not a sign of professionalism. Limitations should be confronted up front. It should be openly and honestly confronted. There should be a tactful combination of reference and explanation of the various methodologies and their limitations of implementation. So it should confront any shortcomings of the research. It should look at the various methodologies, look at the advantages and disadvantages of the various methodologies that could have been used, and then argue for the one that has been selected. Why was the one selected preferable to the others? So why was it a survey? Why wasn't it a focus group? What's the advantages of the survey over the focus group in this context? So the limitations should engage in that type of discussion. The limitations don't have to be set out in great detail, It's looking at the broad picture. Why this technique? Why those questions? Why that sample? Why not a different sample? These are questions that are quite natural questions for the reader to devise when looking across the project. So try to anticipate the reader's questions and answer them in this section. Now, the details of limitation do not detract from the research. In fact, you could argue the opposite. Details of limitations strengthen the research because it's more honest and it's more open, and the reader is made aware of the limitations. There's nothing being hidden away here. Everything's dealt with in the open. And in that sense, it acknowledges honesty and validity on the part of the researcher. And that's to the credit of the researcher. So limitations are a good thing. Now the findings. It's better to report one finding per page and support it with quantitative data. Depends, of course, on the nature of the project. It depends on the topic and the structure of the project and so on. But perhaps findings per one page is too extreme. Perhaps just make a paragraph about one finding and discuss its implications and how it was found in a separate paragraph. It's good to emphasize the findings, and that's why I say report one per page. But as I said, it's no hard and fast rule here. But findings should be emphasized. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Emphasize the findings because that's what the whole exercise was about. It presents the relevant data but makes no attempt to draw any inferences. The findings are the findings. The findings, in other words, follow logically from the analysis. That's all they are. They are the logical outcome of the analysis. Don't try to interpret them or make any inferences about them. Just report them as the findings from the analysis. So it tries to form the patterns. It tries to explain the data, having gone through the analysis. The data has been refined by the analysis and turned into information, if you like. So the data has been converted into information via the analysis. Now, this information is the findings, and these need to be reported. And it may be that it's reporting patterns. It found a pattern of responses on the part of customers to changes in prices, or it found patterns amongst the customers to changes in the design of the product, or whatever. So it's moving in that direction. The findings may be charts, graphs, tables. If there is a lot of these, they may be used in the appendices and just the key charts put into the findings. But charts or graphs should be interpreted and should be explained as well. Don't leave it to the reader to try and work out what the chart or the graph or the table is trying to say. It should be done for the reader. It should be clear. Now, let's move to the conclusions. Conclusions are inferences drawn from the findings and should be directly related to the research objectives or hypotheses. So the conclusions are what come out of the findings. They are directly related to the findings. The conclusions can't be based on anything else. Basing it on something else would be wrong, because that did not appear in this project, in this research project. It's only the work of this research project that can yield the conclusions. So the conclusions are based entirely on the findings. Don't let the reader work on the inferences. Provide the inferences for the reader. Provide the implications of the research and the findings for the reader. Explain the significance of the findings. Explain what was found. Explain the limitations. All of that's been done. And indicate to the reader what's likely to be the outcome of this type of research. In other words, what did the research indicate? What was the outcome? What was the conclusion? Don't leave it for the reader to try and work it out. The conclusion should be justified by the data of the research and limited to those for which the data provide an adequate basis. So the conclusions should be based entirely on the data, and the data was processed by the analysis, by the analytical techniques that were used, statistical or quantitative or qualitative, whatever the techniques were. The data was processed by those, turned into findings, and the findings yield the conclusions. It has to be done that way. Towards the end of the main text, the researcher should again put down the results of the research clearly and precisely. So stating the findings again is not a bad task. This time make it more concise, make it just simple statements. This is what the research found, A, B, C, D, and just bullet point out these are the findings, and it brings back to mind what the findings were, and it's right at the end of the conclusions. So the conclusion is the final summing up. That's what ends the project. Now there can be recommendations. Recommendations may be corrective actions arising out of the research. The research may recommend that the company changes something, some procedure or some product, or it may recommend that the company develop some new product or change its price or enter a new market or whatever. So the recommendations, but the recommendations should be based on the conclusions. It should not be just idle speculations, something in the mind of the researcher, just dreamt up in the mind of the researcher. That's not right. It should be based on the conclusions. They should be based logically on the conclusions. And it should be in line with the results of the report. The recommendations should be explicit. Don't insert recommendations implicitly, just suggesting, but not actually coming out honestly and openly and stating what they are, just suggesting them or hinting at them. They should be made explicit. State the recommendations, and they should be based entirely on the conclusions. By the way, recommendations really only apply in the context of business reports and this type of very applied report, government report, or a particular report addressing a problem, which may have recommendations. Some reports may not have recommendations. They may just deliver the findings, and the recommendations are to be discussed at committee or amongst the management in the companies or discussed elsewhere, and they draw up the recommendations. So sometimes recommendations are included in reports and sometimes they're not. The recommendations may even contain plans for how future research in the area will be undertaken. Just simply say, well, in future, if research in this area is to be conducted, it's recommended that it does the following, and it watches out for the following. So recommendations might be of that nature as well. And the recommendations, as I said, should only be given if the client wants them. So there may not be recommendations on all reports. If they're required, they should be given. And it's important for the researcher right at the start to determine whether recommendations are required or not. Now let's move to the appendices. These, for a start, are optional. You don't have to have appendices, but they're not bad things to have. It's just a section of the report which contains information that the researcher found that was not necessary to the presentation of the findings or the conclusions, but it's information that the reader would not normally have access to, find it difficult to find, perhaps an article or clippings from the press or the questionnaire itself or some issues about the methodology. And these may go into the appendices and be referenced in the main business report. So typically it could include raw data, for example. It would be good to put that into the appendices, because putting the raw data into the main report would just clutter up the main report. Include any calculations. Again, calculations are not necessary perhaps in the main report. The report is more worried about the findings and the conclusions and the recommendations. So put the calculations into the appendices and reference them, and put in any graphs or charts or copies of forms that were used, questionnaires or any information that was acquired through the use of forms or in the build-up of the forms. That could be included in the appendices. Any complex tables, for example, tables of information which would be too complicated to have elsewhere. If the research was conducted by many people in the field, give the instructions that were given to the field workers, to the researchers, to ensure that all the researchers were acting in unison. They're all acting in the same way. So there is no bias creeping in from variations in approach adopted by different field workers. Any quantitative material that would look inappropriate in the main text, quantitative material, just include it in the appendices and reference it. Care should be taken that they do not exist in isolation, and reference to each appendix is given in the text. Don't put information into the appendix unless it's been used. It must be referenced in the main text. If there's material in the appendix that's not referenced in the main text, that's just wasting space and wasting time and effort. So ensure that the information in the appendices are referenced in the main text. Now the bibliography. Well, it's a list of citations or references to books or periodicals on a particular topic, for example journals or books or magazines or whatever. So the bibliography it's a list of sources that are used. If it's work by particular writers, by particular authors, then list the authors alphabetically so that it's easy for the reader to find them. If it's Smith, it comes under S. If it's Jones, it comes under J. So it's alphabetic. The same could happen with periodicals or books or whatever. Just try to refer to them by some logical referencing method. Normally it's on the basis of author, the title of the work, the date, the pages where it's to be found, the book itself, the title of the book, if it's different from the title of the article, who published the book, the publisher, the place of publication, and the date. So there are many elements associated with referencing. But look up referencing, and in fact there are videos on this in this module. But look it up yourself and find out what is the best way of compiling a bibliography. But as I said, there are videos explaining it elsewhere in this module that you should have consulted. Now the index, well, index is given specifically in a published research report. Index does not necessarily appear in a management or a business report. Not unless the report is very long and very detailed with many technical points and many issues, in which case there may be some reference to those, and the various topics and authors and technical points may be indexed, so that right throughout the work an index may be inserted. In fact, many word processors have a facility for indexing projects and indexing written work quite easily by simply inserting a piece of code. Microsoft Word has an indexing function, and many of the other word processors similar to Word also offer this facility. The index contains all the works consulted in the preparation of the report, not just those referred to in the text. So an index can be much wider than just the sources used in the project itself. The index may refer to works that were consulted and works that relate to this, but not necessarily used in the report itself. A consistent referencing format should be used throughout the section. That's the point. And the one that is highly recommended is the Harvard referencing system. And again, there are videos on this available in these course of classes in this module. And there's a lot of information online about how to use the Harvard referencing system. So in this session we've looked at features of the business research report, and we've looked at the various sections that are included in there, or that may be included in there, and what's good practice within each section. It's a long video, so I suggest you go over it several times, stop the video, make your own notes, and add these notes to other videos that relate to the same issues that are produced in this module, so that you get a very comprehensive set of notes about how to draw up a business report. But that's all I'm going to do in this session, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.